Our second reader is Patrice Sarath. Sarath?
Sarath.
Oh, see, I got it wrong. Patrice Sarath. And she is an author and editor living in Austin. Her novels include the fantasy series, The Books of Gordath, Gordath Wood, Red Gold Bridge, and The Crow God's Girl, and also the romance, The Unexpected Miss Bennet. She has been published by Penguin in the US and Robert Hale Limited in the UK. She is also the author of numerous short stories that have appeared in several magazines and anthologies, including Weird Tales, Black Gate, Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, Realms of Fantasy, and many others. Her story, Pigs and Features, originally published in Apex Digest, was reprinted in 2013 in The Best Tales of the Apocalypse by Permuted Press. Patrice is an avid horsewoman. She also enjoys bike riding, rollerblading, and hiking the woods and trails outside Austin. She can often be found writing at her neighborhood coffee house. Please join me in Patrice.
Thank you. I'm going to read from The Unexpected Miss Bennet. And I'm going to start at the beginning, actually, because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the book, and it sort of establishes the character, and obviously this is characters that many of you are going to be familiar with, because it is my sequel to Pride and Prejudice, the famous book by Jane Austen. And so what I did was I did my best to bring to life as much as I could Jane Austen for the 21st century, and this is my homage to, you know, a great master. I am not going to read in a British accent, so you'll just have to imagine that yourself. It is a comforting belief among much of society that a plain girl with a small fortune must have no more interest in matrimony than matrimony has in her. Mrs. Bennet was not a particularly doting mother, but she did have one object, and that was to see all of her daughters married. She was the most often bemused by Mary, her third daughter of 5, and the one with the fewest prospects. It was not that Mary was plain exactly, for she was a Bennet, and the Bennet girls were known as the prettiest in their small neighborhood. But she said the most alarming things, and was full of dire pronouncements on the base leanings of men, of which men were not eager to hear, and though she applied herself diligently to the piano and singing, she was not as accomplished as many another girl who approached the task with rather more gaiety than determination. It might have been with something like relief then, her 2 eldest daughters having made quite eligible matches, that Mrs. Bennet could surrender her vigilance with regards to Mary. For Kitty, some effort must still be made, of course, and that was a daunting enough task in itself. But Mary, Mrs. Bennet owned herself unequal to the task. She confided as much to her eldest daughter Jane on one of her frequent visits that her nerves were not up to finding a husband for Mary. "No, Mary must stay here and be a comfort to me and Mr. Bennet," Mrs. Bennet declared. "And after we die, you must take her in, Jane. She will be no bother. She loves only her piano and her sermons, and she will do quite nicely and will be quite out of the way. She can help you with the children as you begin to have them, and so she will be able to pay her own way." Jane endeavored to assure Mrs. Bennet that she would be able to provide a home for Mary for many more years, and that Mary would find a higher place in Jane's home than governess when such an unhappy event as Mrs. Bennet's passing on came about. But Mrs. Bennet had already flitted on to another topic in which Lady Lucas had offered up some slight, and Mrs. Bennet received the insult so eagerly as to make Jane suspect she enjoyed the opportunity to consider herself ill-used. But what to do about Mary? Jane, ensconced in the height of domestic happiness, began to suffer a niggling doubt. Could it be right that she should be so happy while her middle sister was not? Jane took up an accounting of the Bennet sisters' fortunes. Of the 5, she and her next sister, Elizabeth, were married to men they loved and respected. Their youngest sister, Lydia, had become entangled with a disgraceful rake in circumstances which had brought down a scandal upon the whole family. Then there was Kitty, who, fortunately, was not yet attached. Rather than let her go the way of Lydia, towards which destiny Kitty's nature predisposed her, Jane and Elizabeth had each taken a firmer hand in her upbringing. For the sake of Kitty's future happiness and respectability, they could not let her follow Lydia's example It would not do to have two scandals in one family. There was no need to have such a fear for Mary, who practiced goodness with sober devotion and no little pride, and thus was less susceptible to the wiles of bad men. But even Mary, for all of her sermonizing against the evils of pleasant society, had expressed interest in a more fulfilling life than that of living on her sister's charity. Should not she have a chance of finding such happiness with a like-minded gentleman as Jane had found with her Bingley, or Lizzie with her Darcy? Jane worried, and when Jane worried, she acted. That evening, she composed a letter to Lizzie. Dearest Lizzie, I hope this letter finds you well at Pemberley. Mamma has just left after a long visit, and I confess that I am slightly weary of her nerves. But it was good to have her company, and it was rather like old times. Mr. Bingley left us alone for much of her stay, but he was perfectly amiable to her in her teases. Father was not able to come, and I believe him when he said that he preferred his library at Longbourn to ours, as we are not great readers, though we need to improve, but I think we will see him in a fortnight or sooner. Mamma said something that gave me cause for concern regarding Mary. For all that we were terribly embarrassed when she pushed us towards eligible men, she seems to take no interest in Mary's prospects. She seems resigned, no, content, that Mary may not ever marry, and thinks more of Kitty's debut in London than of Mary's. I am happy to be chaperone to Kitty in public, and I see an improvement in her behavior already, since she is no longer under Lydia's sway, poor misguided soul. I think, though, that we should not neglect Mary. She is as unformed in her way as Kitty is, and though her opinions are firm, she holds them with little understanding of society and the world. I think we do a grave disservice to her if we do not offer her the same guidance that we give to Kitty, and I think it will be just as well received, if not better, by Mary. I await your reply anxiously. Give my love to Darcy and Georgiana. Jane. With this letter, Jane hatched her plot and waited for Lizzie's reply. Lizzie gave a fond smile when she received and read the missive. Always like Jane to think of others as deserving of all good fortune that fell to her. But if the world were as just as it claimed to be, all good fortune would be heaped upon Jane and those of like character, and there would be none for the rest of us, Lizzie said to herself, and that would not do at all. She stood and paced the small sitting room that she had claimed for her own when she became mistress of Pemberley. The great house was hardly a house at all, and its inhabitants, Lizzie, her young sister-in-law Georgiana, and her husband Darcy, rattled about in it as loosely as buttons in an old hat box. Elizabeth was used to cozier comforts. Longbourn was small and old and respectably shabby. This little room, which received the afternoon sun and looked out over a small bit of wilderness, reminded her of her childhood and her upbringing. When her gaze fell on a miniature of her husband and all that it represented, she knew that Jane was right. Perhaps Mary would never find such happiness, but to withhold any opportunity from her by the simple expedient of assuming that she of all others would never fall in love, that she would never attract a respectable man, was as prejudiced a thought as any that Lizzie had ever been susceptible to. For we all know how that turned out, she thought. My prejudice almost cost me my love. How much more dangerous then to hold such assumptions concerning my sister and to wield such power by omission as to prevent her from ever discovering whether there is a man for her. Jane is right. We must do all we can for Mary. When she entered her husband's study and gave him a kiss as he bent over his letters, he smiled up at her, his expression lightening so much that it melted her heart. You have the look of mischief about you, Mr. Darcy said, much as when we first met and exchanged words. Have I need to fear? Not at all, she said. I merely came to warn you that I am my mother's daughter after all. Jane and I are prepared to make a match for Mary. So that's the first chapter. I'm going to leave you there. The reason why I wrote The Unexpected Miss Bennet is because of a great mystery in Pride and Prejudice, which is, why on earth did Mary Bennet not marry Mr. Collins? They were perfect for each other. So it's never even considered really in the book. And it was one of those things where I felt that the original author had really given one of her great characters short shrift. And I thought I would remedy that. Not hubris at all, is it? You know, that was why I wrote the story, and essentially because I'd been thinking about it for a long time. It basically wrote itself. And so it was a lot of fun. I had a great time. and just enjoyed, just enjoyed the hell out of it. It was a lot of fun. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
What are you working on now?
I'm working on a story, because I'm mostly a fantasist, mostly a fantasy writer. I'm working on a secondary world fantasy with Regency elements. Not the romance so much as the Regency culture, lifestyle, and more of the Regency atmosphere. So I'm melding my two worlds.
So had you written a number of science fiction or kind of fantasy books or articles before you wrote Miss Bennett? Is that something kind of you took a sidestep and just did Miss Bennett?
Yeah, this is a sidestep, definitely. I fully expected my career to be primarily fantasy with some romantic elements, but primarily fantasy and science fiction. Did this because I needed to get it out of my system. It was a story that demanded to be written. So I thought, okay, I'll go ahead and do that. And like I said, it was, I wrote it very quickly. I did a lot of research, primarily researching and rereading all of Jane Austen's body of work, and found out that although this book is based on Pride and Prejudice, there are two others of her books that I got a new appreciation for. Mansfield Park, if anyone is wondering, and Emma. Emma, I think, is her absolute masterwork. And anyway, so it was great to revisit an author who I'd always loved but never really analyzed, and to analyze and then get to see more and more of the depth that she has. Anyone? Go ahead.
I think you said that you'd written a short story.
I do, yeah.
I wonder if you could say a word about the difference in the experiences of writing a short story as opposed to writing a novel.
So in my experience, they're very different forms. People think that many people will think of a short story as just a shorter novel, or that a novel is a longer short story, but the structure is really different. The thing about short stories is that they are more reliant on structure than maybe a novel is. And you have limited space, every word has to count, and everything is driving toward the end, perhaps in a way that in a novel that's not quite the case. I'm not saying that there's a twist ending in every short story, but everything generally needs to wrap up to a conclusion. There are people who find that they are naturally short story writers and not novelists at all. I can do both, but each time I switch from one form to the other, it takes a while. It definitely takes a while to get myself back into what I'm doing. So I would say that's the major difference, structure. Anyone? All righty. Thank you very much.